Picture this scenario. A television personality who built his reputation conducting genuine patient therapy faces hosts who've dedicated years to publicly diagnosing politicians they've never met. Someone whose entire professional foundation rests on reading behavioral patterns encounters personalities whose actions communicate volumes beyond their spoken statements. Before we dive into this incredible story, please hit that subscribe button and tell us in comments what you really think caused Dr. Phil to completely lose it on live television. When a carefully constructed inquiry aimed at securing expert validation for deeply held political animosity explodes because the specialist categorically refuses to participate in therapeutic malpractice. This isn't your typical partisan shouting match or predictable ideological combat. This represents the precise instant when Dr. Phil, someone who invested decades providing actual clinical treatment rather than broadcasting remote psychological evaluations, demonstrated that mental health science cannot become a political instrument. This captures Joy Behar learning that summoning genuine expertise into your studio environment carries significant risk when that authority figure operates with unshakable professional principles. This reveals what transpires when hosts solicit expert perspectives, anticipating confirmation, yet receive uncomfortable truth instead. Phil McGraw entered that broadcast space fully understanding their intentions. They wanted professional cover for ideological positions, clinical verification that their opposition targets suffered mental disorders, scholarly ammunition justifying their predetermined disgust. What he delivered instead constituted a teaching moment in authentic psychological methodology. He held up a mirror reflecting their own conduct patterns and reinforced that legitimate diagnosis demands more than observing public figures through television screens while harboring personal dislike. Behar believed she'd engineered an easy setup allowing Phil to rubber stamp everything their program had broadcast for years. Instead, she received education distinguishing genuine psychology from political performance art, separating clinical assessment from partisan warfare. And that expression crossing her features when realization struck, that priceless instant when someone discovers their carefully laid trap has ensnared them rather than their intended victim. That moment alone justified watching. Prepare yourselves, because what develops isn't merely compelling television content. It's instruction in how authentic expertise manifests when it categorically rejects weaponization for political agendas, how scientific methodology operates when maintaining its integrity despite intense pressure toward abandonment. What happens when someone finally confronts the amateur diagnosticians who've been practicing medicine without licenses for ratings benefits? The View's studio buzzed with characteristic morning energy. The panel members assumed their positions, carrying the assured confidence of performers who'd executed this production countless times previously. The discussion topic had been predetermined, the story arc mapped out comprehensively, the rhythm carefully orchestrated to generate precisely the content their viewership anticipated. Political analysis disguised as authentic concern. Ideological attacks masquerading as legitimate questioning. Phil sat opposite them, projecting the calm certainty of someone who'd faced cameras for decades, who'd navigated innumerable interviews, who comprehended media mechanics but remained unbeholden to them. He possessed that characteristic blend of accessible warmth and professional command that had established his household recognition. Approachable, yet commanding. Personable, yet not easily controlled. The dialogue had progressed through multiple subjects, constructing toward the moment Joy had been mentally rehearsing all morning. She'd completed her preparation, formulated her inquiry, built what she considered an impenetrable framework that would permit Phil to validate everything their show had proclaimed about their preferred political opponent. This was supposed to generate endorsement, professional blessing of stances they'd already publicly committed to supporting. However, Joy had committed a critical strategic error. She'd presumed Phil would prioritize being an accommodating guest over being an ethical psychologist. She'd overlooked that certain professionals value their credibility more than television exposure or audience appreciation. She was moments away from that harsh lesson. So, Joy initiated, her vocal tone carrying that distinctive quality of someone convinced they're executing clever strategy. You can't diagnose anybody from afar, somebody they haven't examined, doctors, therapists, but a lot of respected psychologists out there, really big-time, big names, are saying that Donald Trump is showing signs of narcissism. She halted for dramatic impact, transparently believing she constructed this perfectly. Which, by the way, one of the symptoms is being preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited power, success, and brilliance, and they're questioning that he has narcissistic disorder. Number one, do you think that's a mental illness, narcissism? And if so, is he fit to be president? The inquiry lingered momentarily, packed with presumptions and engineered to compel one specific response. But Phil had operated in this arena far too extensively to stumble into such transparent manipulation. Well, counselor, doctor, Phil responded, his voice conveying amusement at the obvious setup attempt. That's a compound question, and I object. The crowd reacted with laughter. Though Phil wasn't performing comedy, he was already establishing that he wouldn't be manipulated into addressing loaded inquiries designed to manufacture predetermined outcomes. He was a psychologist, not a political strategist, and he was preparing to illustrate that distinction. You know, people talk about narcissism, he proceeded, retrieving actual documentation. But they don't really know what it means. So I brought a list from the DSM-5 about what narcissism really is, because if I asked people to stand up and define it, they wouldn't know. This was already deviating from expectation. Joy had anticipated validation, not educational instruction. She desired Phil to confirm that the political personality they despised suffered mental illness. Instead, he was preparing to deliver genuine psychological education, complete with clinical definitions from the diagnostic reference that practitioners actually utilize. Let's just take a look, Dr. Phil stated, consulting his documentation. One has a grandiose sense of self-importance. Before continuation was possible, Joy interjected enthusiastically. Check. 2, is preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, or brilliance, which you said? Check. Joy repeated, visibly pleased that Phil appeared to be confirming her assessment. 3 believes that he or she is special or unique, can only be understood by special people. Check. Joy's voice now carried triumphant energy, as though each listed criterion was proving her hypothesis rather than constructing towards something entirely different. 4, requires excessive admiration. Oh, check, check. Joy was nearly euphoric now, convinced this was proceeding exactly according to her plan. Phil continued reading through the diagnostic framework, his delivery remaining steady and clinical, permitting Joy to interrupt with her eager confirmations. Has a sense of entitlement, which means is very thin-skinned if criticized, is interpersonally exploitative, lacks empathy, has the inability to stand in other people's shoes and understand. Like when he makes fun of people who are handicapped, Joy inserted, unable to resist appending her personal interpretation. "I'm just reading it, Doctor," Phil responded calmly. A gentle warning that she was editorializing rather than listening properly. "You interpret it however you want." Is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of him or her. Shows arrogant and haughty behaviors. He lifted his gaze from his notes with an expression suggesting the genuine lesson was about to commence in earnest. How many people does that describe? Joy sensed something transforming, but couldn't quite perceive the trap she'd entered. "That's a lot of people," she conceded. And then Phil delivered the statement that would become this interview's defining instant. The words that would be shared thousands of times across digital platforms. The declaration that perfectly encapsulated what had just transpired. "Well, that is a lot of people," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable significance. "And if you take out everybody that has any of those characteristics, then you're going to take out a lot of people, including some at this table." The quiet that followed was absolutely deafening. The camera perfectly captured Joy's facial transformation. The instant when confidence converted to comprehension, when someone realizes they've been outmaneuvered, when the mirror gets positioned and the reflection proves unflattering. Her expression underwent visible metamorphosis. Bewilderment, acknowledgement, barely suppressed fury, all flashing across her features within mere seconds. Phil had just accomplished something remarkable. He'd taken Joy's attempt at weaponizing psychology for political purposes and transformed it into genuine psychological assessment. Not of the political personality they wanted to assault, but of the people conducting the assault. He'd allowed them to enthusiastically confirm every symptom on the narcissism checklist, and then calmly indicated that those identical symptoms described them. The remaining panel members shifted uncomfortably in their positions. The audience, which had been eagerly following along with Joy's checks and validations, suddenly went silent as the implications registered. This wasn't the endorsement session they'd anticipated. This was a psychology instructor, catching his students in their own contradiction. Joy attempted recovery, her voice elevating with defensive indignation. "Things that we go through. You wouldn't look at President Obama and say he has narcissistic disorder, so you can't just say they all have it." But Phil wasn't retreating from the point he'd established. "People have all the things you said. We just checked every one of them. I said, most leaders are under a lot of stress and pressure. So a lot of them will show anxiety, depression at different times. A lot of leaders will have some affliction at different times because of the pressure and demands of the office." The sophistication of his response operated on multiple levels. First, he'd refused to weaponize psychology for political objectives. He wouldn't diagnose anyone he hadn't personally examined, regardless of political orientation. Second, he'd indicated that numerous personality characteristics exist along a continuum, that what resembles narcissism from distance might be normal, leadership assertiveness, self-confidence, or the psychological defenses people construct to manage extraordinary demands. Third, and most devastatingly, he'd utilized Joy's own enthusiasm to apply these labels, demonstrating that she possessed numerous identical characteristics she was so rapid to identify in others. The irony was substantial enough to be tangible. Here was a program that had invested years diagnosing a political personality from distance, that had invited countless experts to validate their amateur psychology, that had weaponized mental health language for political attacks, and the singular occasion they brought on someone with genuine expertise and professional ethics. He'd turned their weapon back toward them. Joy's face had cycled through several shades of crimson, her body language broadcasting discomfort, even as she attempted maintaining her composure. She'd anticipated an ally who would confirm her biases. Instead, she'd obtained a professional who'd exposed those biases for their true nature, political hostility dressed in psychological terminology, partisan attacks wrapped in the legitimacy of clinical language. The confrontation revealed something profound about the distinction between authentic expertise and television expertise. Phil could have easily accommodated, could have provided Joy the sound bites she desired, could have utilized his credentials to validate whatever position would make him popular with the audience and hosts. Many television experts do precisely that. They understand their function is providing professional-sounding confirmation of whatever narrative the program is promoting. But Phil had constructed his career on something more substantial than television popularity. He'd actually treated patients, had studied psychology at the highest academic levels, had maintained professional ethics even when they became inconvenient for his entertainment career. And in that moment, faced with a choice between being an accommodating guest and being an ethical psychologist, he chose his professional integrity. The implications extended far beyond one interview or one political personality. Phil had just demonstrated what actual psychological assessment resembles versus the partisan performance that had been masquerading as mental health concern. Real psychology requires examination, context, understanding the complete picture rather than cherry-picking behaviors that confirm pre-existing judgments. More significantly, he'd exposed the dangerous practice of armchair diagnosis that had become so prevalent in political discourse. When you start deciding that political opponents must be mentally ill, when you weaponize clinical terminology for partisan purposes, when you use the language of psychology to delegitimize people you simply disagree with, you're not practicing psychology. You're practicing politics with a medical veneer. And by calmly, almost casually indicating that Joy herself exhibited many of the characteristics she was so eager to diagnose in others, Phil had revealed the fundamental projection at work. People who spend their days analyzing others' narcissism rarely stop to examine their own. People who are quickest to throw around clinical diagnoses of their enemies rarely apply those same standards to themselves. The audience, initially eager to hear professional confirmation of their political views, had witnessed something unexpected, an actual lesson in psychology that challenged rather than confirmed their assumptions. Some appeared thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering how quickly they'd adopted armchair diagnosis. Others appeared defensive, uncomfortable with having their certainty challenged. But Joy appeared angry, not the performative anger that she often deployed on the show for effect, but genuine frustration at being outmaneuvered in her own studio. She'd brought Phil on specifically to obtain ammunition for her political attacks, and instead he'd used his expertise to reflect her own behavior back at her. The remaining time in the segment was awkward, filled with attempts to redirect the conversation that never quite recovered the energy or purpose. Phil had accomplished something rare in modern television. He'd refused to let his expertise be weaponized, had maintained professional ethics despite pressure to abandon them, and had demonstrated that some people still value truth over tribal allegiance. As the interview concluded and Phil left the set, the host tried to process what had happened, to make sense of a guest who'd refused to validate their narrative. But their analysis missed the point entirely, because they were still operating within the framework that Phil had rejected. the idea that psychology could and should be used as a political weapon. In the aftermath, as clips of the exchange spread across social media, reactions split along predictable lines. Those who shared Joy's political views accused Phil of being partisan himself, of defending someone who clearly exhibited problematic behavior. Those who opposed Joy's politics celebrated Phil for exposing the hypocrisy and projections so evident in her questioning. But the more thoughtful responses came from mental health professionals who recognized what Phil had actually done. He'd defended the integrity of their field against those who would reduce it to political theater. He'd reminded everyone that clinical diagnosis is serious business that requires training, examination, and professional ethics, not television appearances and political hatred. This is why the Goldwater Rule exists, one psychologist noted, referring to the American Psychiatric Association's ethical guideline against diagnosing public figures you haven't personally examined. Phil just demonstrated why it's so important. When you start diagnosing from afar based on behavior you don't like, you're not doing psychology. You're doing politics. Another observation captured the deeper significance. Watch Joy's face when Phil says, "including some at this table." That's the moment she realizes she's been describing herself. That's what projection looks like when it gets called out. The brilliance of Phil's approach was in its simplicity. He didn't refuse to discuss narcissism or claim it wasn't a real condition. He didn't defend or attack any specific political figure. He simply laid out the actual clinical criteria. Let Joy eagerly confirm that those criteria described someone she hated, and then pointed out that those same criteria described a lot of people, including people sitting right there in the studio. By refusing to play the game Joy wanted him to play, by maintaining his professional integrity instead of becoming another political operative with credentials, Phil had done something increasingly rare in modern media. He'd valued truth over team loyalty, substance over spectacle, professional ethics over entertainment value. Behar had invited an expert onto her show, expecting validation. What she got instead was education, mirror-holding, and a reminder that expertise means something beyond simply having the credentials to say what people want to hear. Real experts maintain standards even when those standards become inconvenient. Real professionals refuse to weaponize their fields for political purposes. Real integrity looks like choosing to be right over choosing to be popular. The broader lesson extended far beyond the view or one political figure, or even psychology specifically. In a culture where expertise had been increasingly weaponized for partisan purposes, where credentials were often used to provide professional-sounding confirmation of political positions rather than actual expertise, Phil had demonstrated what integrity looks like when it refuses to be compromised. He'd shown that you could disagree with someone politically without diagnosing them with mental illness. You could recognize problematic behavior without reducing it to clinical pathology. You could maintain your professional standards even when pressure and opportunity aligned to suggest abandoning them. Most importantly, he'd revealed the dangerous narcissism, real narcissism, not political diagnosis, of people who spend their days analyzing others without ever examining themselves. The eagerness with which Joy had checked off every symptom of narcissism when applied to someone she hated, combined with her complete blindness to those same symptoms in herself, perfectly illustrated the projection and lack of self-awareness that characterizes actual narcissistic behavior. The View moved on to its next segment, next guest, next controversy. The news cycle continued. But for those who'd witnessed that moment, something important had been demonstrated. That expertise still mattered when exercised with integrity. That professional standards still existed even when culture pressured people to abandon them. And that sometimes the most powerful thing an expert can do is refuse to let their expertise be weaponized for purposes it was never intended to serve. Phil left that studio exactly as he'd entered it. Professionally credible, ethically grounded, unwilling to compromise his standards for anyone's convenience. He hadn't won any political points or gained any partisan allies. What he'd done was something more valuable. He defended the integrity of his field, had reminded everyone that clinical psychology is a science, not a political weapon, and had demonstrated that some people still value being right over being popular. Behar had tried to use psychology to attack her political opponents. Phil had used psychology to reveal her own behavior. And in that simple reversal, in that moment when the mirror got turned around, everyone watching learned something about projection, about narcissism, and about what happens when you invite a real expert, expecting validation, and get education instead. That's what made the moment memorable and significant. Not because it settled any political debate or proved anyone right or wrong about any specific figure, but because it demonstrated that truth still matters more than tribe, that integrity still exists even when convenience suggests abandoning it, and that some people still refuse to let their expertise be reduced to ammunition in culture wars. Phil had been asked to diagnose someone from afar for political purposes. He'd refused and instead held up a mirror. And what that mirror revealed about projection, about narcissism, about the people doing the diagnosing rather than the person being diagnosed was far more illuminating than any partisan soundbite could have been. The look on Joy Behar's face when she realized what had happened, when the trap she'd set caught her instead of her target, when the psychology lesson she'd requested became a lesson about her own behavior. That moment captured everything. The discomfort of seeing yourself clearly, the anger at having assumptions challenged, the recognition that expertise means something beyond simply confirming what you already believe. Phil had given the view exactly what they needed, even if it wasn't what they wanted, not validation, but education. Not ammunition, but insight. Not confirmation of their biases, but a mirror reflecting their own behavior back at them. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone watching that real expertise, exercised with real integrity, sometimes means telling people what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear, even when that makes you unpopular, even when that costs you opportunities, even when that means being the villain in someone else's narrative rather than the hero in your own. If this breakdown opened your eyes to how real expertise operates in a world full of performance, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think happened in that studio. This is Late Night Legend, where we break down the moments that matter.